Do you like what you hear? Then you need a Devon bass. Devon bass. Better by design. Whether you're old school or whether you're new school, we discuss it all for the only one that matters. Christian Talk with Christian musicians. Today we interview George Sandler, a Metro Atlanta gigging musician and session player. Let's join our interview in progress.
I had to update my software.
I hear you. Yeah, technology's not always my friend.
No, neither is it mine. So it's all good. You can hear me, right?
Yep. I hear you fine. You're looking good.
Hooray. All right.
Yeah, I used to be, when I was in my previous life as an engineer, I used to design networks, multi-million-dollar networks over satellite, for a satellite company. And my team got the Olympics from Sydney to around the world over about half a dozen different satellites that my company had. And so
Oh, wow.
Now it's just like, I'll be going over my son's house, and I'll call my grandson over. Roran, come over here. Daddy, Grandpa can't make this work. How do I make this phone do what I want it to do? And he says, and his stock answer is, Papa, I could explain it to you, but I think we'll get it done sooner if I just do it.
Well, and there's some stuff, I still feel like a neophyte on some of the stuff that I do. I'm running Logic here, and, but sometimes I just feel like I'm going about it. I get it done, but I feel like I'm going about it the long way. And I need to, do some research as far as Logic for Dummies and all that stuff. And I just haven't done
well,
that.
When I got my heart diagnosis, and then when the pandemic hit, I had to do a really quick run towards virtual everything, because for about a year and a half, I couldn't do any in-person lessons. So for a year and a half, I switched all the way over to virtual lessons. And dude, there's a truckload of technology that you have to do
Absolutely.
to pull that off.
Yep. And, I've got a GoPro back there, and I had a GoPro here that my son decided to take with him. So whatever, I don't know. But
well, isn't that the way our kids are? Hey, Dad, what's yours is mine.
Well, yeah. Apparently he feels that way, and I'm like, I'll just buy another GoPro eventually. But it was just like, are you using this? I'm like, well, not today. Maybe on another day. But
my son and I, we have this standing joke. I have an upright electric fretless bass, and I'm not using a whole bunch, so I just gave it to him for one Christmas. Well, it's become the white elephant gift between he and I, because every Christmas, he's going to get that bass back this Christmas, and the next Christmas I expect him to give it back to me. But it's been bouncing back and forth between my house and his studio, and we both love it. Man. But it's probably the most useless instrument I've ever owned.
Well, it's very specialized. I don't know guys that I know guys that own one, and who used to bring them along with two or three other basses to sessions. And now it's like, man, if you want me to bring that thing, I'll bring it. But you got to give me, but I'm not bringing it just because, I bring it.
Yeah. Well, and for years I had extended range basses, 6 and 7 string basses. That was my thing. And I loved them.
Right.
And I don't know what's happened. It's like I turned 60. I'm going, the P bass and the jazz bass was good enough for Jocko and them fellas back in the 70s. And so
I hear you.
I throw all my extended range basses at my son. They're great basses. They sound awesome. They're great, fun to play. But I went out and bought a 70s reissue P bass, and I've got a fretless 4-string with the glass neck like what Jocko had. And dude, that's it. That's all this old boy needs.
I think if you have a 4 and maybe a 5 and a fretless, you should be good.
Yep.
And if as long as it's a 4 that's versatile, and a 5 that's versatile, and a fretless. And I mean fretless, but even then, you know, it just depends on what you're doing.
Yep.
So.
And it's and P bass, that defined the rock and roll sound of the 70s. I mean, it was all P bass. Now Jocko brought the jazz bass to the front of the stage, but pretty much when you're listening to the Doobie Brothers and folks like that, and some of them had alembics, but it was almost always a P bass with flat wound strings.
Absolutely.
Played with the pick.
You know?
Boom.
Yep.
Loving it.
Yep.
Well, hey, let me. Here's what I've started this I'm going to be starting this podcast in January, and it's a passion project for me. This last year, 16 months, I've spent that time learning the technology to pull something like this stuff off by doing Bible devotions, and I'm doing like Facebook Live, and then I've got I'm sending out podcasts to Anchor and all that kind of stuff. It's taken me 16 months to make all that crap work. And
I understand.
I'm to the point now where it's smooth. I got it nailed out.
Okay.
But the name of this podcast is for an audience of one. And every Sunday when I play at church, that's my tagline I put on Facebook. Playing for an audience of one. There's a picture of my guitar or whatever. And what I really want to do is I really want to reach out and interview musicians who play on both sides of the fence, the church fence and the secular fence.
Yep.
And just kind of get your thoughts on, you know, I gave you some questions, you know, challenges in session work, live gigs, church gigs. The big one, I just interviewed Nico Lembo. I think you know him.
Yep, he's a good guy.
He's an awesome guy. I played with him a couple times. And the last question, what do you wish folks understood about drummers? He couldn't stop laughing for about 30 seconds. He says, "Oh, I got a list."
Yeah, I do too. So, but it's you know.
Go ahead.
Well, I wouldn't trade it. I mean, with all of the, I don't want to call them pitfalls. Let's say challenges of the instrument, and maybe even the challenges of just the sheer navigating the instrument or transporting the instrument or setting up the instrument. Don't know that I would rather do anything else. And I'm 56. I'll be 57 next week. And I still get guys going, man, don't you wish you played the trumpet or the piccolo or something like that? And I always go, no, man. I really don't, because for me, and I can't, you can see, this is the drum room of my studio.
Right.
But I also have across the hall percussion. And if you look in if you go in the hallway, I've got a rack, 2 racks of snare drums, drum heads, and a bunch of percussion stuff. And then, you know, like I said, a room full of percussion. I got a set of congas, a bunch of cowbells.
Do you have any real furniture at your house, or do you just use parts of your drums for tables?
Oh, no. This is a separate, hey man, this is a separate entity unto itself, because I know, you know, it's funny because Billy Gewin, he really didn't have a stitch of furniture in his house. He's got gear. and I think that's cool, but I can't, I just couldn't live like that. So fortunately
I don't know if you remember this. It was probably back in the 90s, but I had a session. Tim Alexander was recording an album, and you were the drummer, and I started out being the bass player, and I fired myself from the gig because it was the most frustrating thing, because I just started playing bass after being off it for about 15, 16 years.
Right.
And I fired myself from the gig because I couldn't find the pocket if I had an Indian guide and a flashlight. It was... And dude, you know, and it wasn't your fault. You're solid as a rock. But I remember coming home, calling up a friend of mine, Mark Miller in Washington State, who's a session player. And I said, Mark, you got to help me out, man. I had a chance to play with this drummer. It was awesome. I was looking forward to it. And I suck. I just suck. And I told him what the deal was. I said, can you help me? He said, yeah, but only if you promise to listen. If you're not going to listen, don't waste my time. I said,
wow.
Well, now that's the kind of friend he is. He's straight up and down. And I said, okay, well, what do you want me to do? He said, you're in a church band, right? I said, yeah. Next Sunday, go to your church. It was Tim's church, Eastwood Baptist, I think. And he said, I don't want you to tell anybody about this conversation, but I want you to go to church, and I want you to play only the root of the chord, and I want you to play only what the drummer is playing on his kick for your rhythm pattern. That's it. Don't talk to him about it. Just do it. Lock in. So I did it. And then at the end of the service, we always go to the green room and have a decompression time, talk about what worked, what didn't. And I walked in, and everybody, the whole room was abuzz. Wow, that was so solid. Man, I don't think we have ever felt that tight. Holy crap. I wonder what the difference was. And I'm sitting over in the corner going, yeah. I'm the reason we sucked for 2 years.
But I understand what you're saying. I do understand what you're saying. All I can tell you is, when I started playing in college, they taught you grooves, but they also taught you more chop things.
Yeah. Well, when we're young, chops are all important.
Right. And I remember doing an audition. I'll never forget this. I was doing an audition for a band called the T. Lewis Band. And Tony was a great guy. And Randy, was it Randy Miller playing bass? Unbelievable bass players in Nashville now. Tony, I forget what Tony played guitar. And they had Don Langworthy playing sax and keys. It was a great band. They did the Ramada Inn, Holiday Inn circuit. Mm-hmm. And I went in for the audition, and I remember doing something like just over, like playing like on the bass drum and just playing and doing multiple things. And I remember Tony looking at me, and he was going, yeah. And he said, well, we appreciate you coming. And they start, and I was like, okay. And they started playing something, and it was old time rock and roll. And I just started playing the groove. Boom, 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 boom. And Randy said, that's how you need to play. He said, he even told Tony, and Tony was like, man, I'm not sure. He said, he can play groove. He can play groove. And so they hired me, and under much tutelage from them, I learned that all that stuff wasn't, it's important at times, but it's less important most of the time. And it was, they hired me because I could play, I had a feel, and I could play a groove. So the first part of my audition was a big fat waist. And then I remember when I went to the Armed Forces School of Music and I auditioned, and everywhere I'd been up until that point, I was like 18, 19. So everywhere, on my high school and all that kind of stuff, I was the big fish in the pond on the bass guitar. Yeah. I was the guy. Jocko was big. I could do Jocko licks, and I could play the chicken, and I could play all these Jocko-ish type things. And Stanley Clark, Return to Forever, was getting really big about then. And so I remember So Long Mickey Mouse. I do all that stuff. So I go to take my audition, and the bass instructor stares at me after I played. He says, man, I'm glad I got 6 months to work with you. He said, I think I can get you through the course. Oh, I thought he was just pulling my leg, right? So I went out, and within 2 weeks, I discovered that I was one of 5 bass players in the Armed Forces School of Music, and I was the 5th best bass player. So after much hard work, practice, putting hours and hours and hours and hours in paying attention to all my lessons, I graduated 5th best bass player. I never made it out of the basement. It was the most humiliating experience, but it was the best thing that ever freaking happened to me. Right. Because the only way I could get my instructor's approval was to play groove. He said, you've got happy hands. Shut up. It's hard sometimes because we want to unleash those things. But I will tell you, the older I get, the less I play, I think.
Oh man, that is so true.
I'm more concerned with the quality of sound rather than the amount of notes I'm playing, if that makes sense. Yeah. And in fact, a lot of times, like with bass drum patterns, I like to play boom, 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 or just straight 4-on-floor. I mean, I can do anything else, but sometimes if a bass player is playing, a bunch of notes, it doesn't make sense for me to play along. It makes sense for me to lay boom, crack, boom,
right.
Crack. So
did you ever hear? Do you ever know a guy named Cliff Davies? He used to be Ted Nugent's drummer.
I met him one time. Yes, I did.
and he produced Grand Funk Railroad. Well, he had a little studio at his house in Hiram. He retired, and I was his go-to bass guy. And before he committed suicide, he had a very bad reaction to medicine that he was on, and he just had a psychotic break. But up until that time, he took me to school. He's the most brilliant musician I've ever met. He had a doctor's degree in musicology from University of Michigan or something like that. The guy was amazing. But he told me, he says, the biggest lesson I got from him, he says, when you're playing in a band, don't think like a bass player. Think like a record producer.
Right.
Listen to the band that's going around. Say, what can you do to make the drummer's job easier? What can you do to make that singer feel really comfortable with where she's at or he's at?
Right.
And he says, and please remember, the most important part of the song is the melody. And dude, you're like 4 staves on the score away from that. You're in the
absolutely.
basement. And he says, your job is to make that melody pop, not to play it.
You know,
and I went to school on that.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because for me, like, okay, let's say I'm in a session and I'm there and we're doing a vocal thing. My biggest thing now is that I will think a tad slower just for the vocals, because I'm like, okay, look, what are you singing there? And if we're playing the chorus and it seems rushed and I can't understand what you're saying, I'm like, I'll be the first one to go, let's slow this down, because we can't understand what you're saying. And I think you're going to kill yourself trying to sing this. Mm-hmm. And I just always err on the side of I mean, like it or not, most of the time what I get to see is the butt of the front person. Yeah. That's my view. That's my view. You know, it's that whole 50 feet from stardom thing that if you ever saw that movie, you know,
I did.
Well, it's kind of like, for me, 15 feet from whatever, and all I get to see is the back or the butt of whoever's singing in front of me. Right. But if I'm doing my job, that butt's moving. And it's doing what it needs. I'm doing what I need to do.
Mm-hmm. You know, makes wonderful sense. Vic Wooten was asked once about groove. He says, oh, groove isn't what you play. It's what you don't play.
Yep.
He says, the holes, play the holes. The holes are every bit as important. And I just remember working with Cliff. Like he said, when I did pop gigs with them, I'd lock in with his kick. But when I did jazz, when I did a jazz gig with him, he always called everybody Love. And it just irritated the crap out of me. He said, Pikes Love. Cliff, this is Paulding, oh by God County, okay? I'm not your love. He said, all right then, Pikes Love. This is what I want you to do. And then he'd say, when we're on a pop gig, lock in with my kick. But when we're doing jazz, pay no attention to me. You're walking. You're the timekeeper, and I'm going to dance around you. So don't listen to me. And little things like that just made that groove isn't everything. It's the only thing.
Right.
That's become my motto.
And I sometimes I just feel like, you know, I'll listen to something and I'll go, was that really necessary? Is that going to make or break the song? So it just depends. So, but I think people, if there's anything I might get hired for, it's because I can play a groove. I certainly don't think I think I'm a good rock drummer. I'm a good pop drummer. I can play funk. I definitely have a hand on country, both old and new. I really like playing old country. Mm-hmm. Really do. Jazz, if you wanted me to do a straight up bebop gig, I would do it, but I would probably not be, if it was like, oh, we're going to play 5 nights a week bebop. I'm like, I'm not your guy. I'm just not your guy. Just because, but I can do it.
A man should know his limitations.
I think that's really important to do that.
You know, it's funny. I had a student ask me. He was a bass student. He was doing this slap and popping thing, and he says, "Can you do that, Mr. Goward?" I said, "Sure." I played some. I said, "But ask me how often I've been asked to play that in a recording session over the last 40 years." He said, "Well, how many times have you had to do that in 40?" I said, 0.
Yeah.
And I said, and here's why. I said, it's not that it's a cool technique. Bass sounds cool when you do it, but the minute you do that, you become a front of the house man's EQ nightmare. because it changes so much on the tone and everything. It gets lost in the middle of everything. And honestly, unless you're doing a bass solo, and now I should back up a little bit, because there's some R&B things where it's great, but they're not doing the crazy stuff. They're not doing they still go boom, boing, boom, that kind of stuff. That's fine. But I tell them, I said, I've never been asked to do it, so I just don't even practice that stuff anymore.
I think there is something to that, but one of my favorite R&B bass players is Verdine White, and I've never heard him slap ever. He's just yeah, he doesn't even play with a pick. It's all fingers and just. I mean, to me, if you want the best R&B funk player you can get, Verdine White's your guy. From Earth, Wind & Fire. If you don't know who that is, I know you know who that is.
Yeah.
Whoever's watching,
he's up there in my Mount Rushmore. There's Jocko, there's Verdine White, there's the guy from Motown, Jamerson. And Stanley Clark maybe.
Yeah, and
I think they're all finger players.
What's his name? A friend of mine. I don't want to drop names here. But Sonny Emery is a friend of mine. We went to college together. Of course, we don't get talked much anymore because he's so busy. But I was at a party for Jack Bell, who is our instructor at Georgia State, and I said, "Man, I hadn't talked to you in a while." I said, "You got to tell me what it's like to play with Verdine," because he played with Earth, Wind & Fire. He said it's like putting on this warm, enveloping coat, and it's just it's smooth, but he said it's just an incredible experience. So, there's that.
Yeah, hey, now, how would you compare a live gig to different challenges that session work gives you that a live gig doesn't?
Okay. All right. So for me, with session work, I thought about this when you sent me the question. So, like, most of the time, I shouldn't say all the time, but most of the time, I'm not using a click live except for in church situations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So in the studio, we always play. I can't tell you a session in the last 15, almost 20 years that did not have a click track. And so that's number one, locking in with that and making it feel good as opposed to feeling metronomic.
Right.
There's a way to do it that you can push and pull. I think from what I understand from various engineers that have mixed or whatever, I think Rick Marotta does this too. I tend to draw out my fills a little bit. They're in time, but if I'm going to do them, I make sure that every note counts and it makes them broader.
Put some space and drag it out a little.
A little bit. I also probably, if my kick is on the beat, my snare drum's just going to be that much behind it. But as far as that goes, it's playing with a click. It's also, and I know this sounds crazy, but coming up with a lot of songs, you got to come up with like a drum pickup.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the challenges for me is not doing the same doggone thing every time. And really kind of making it to where it doesn't sound like a drum solo, like a wheelchair falling down the steps, but it doesn't sound like that last thing I just did an hour and a half ago.
Yeah. It's funny. Cliff got me working with a click, and he says, Pagelove, whatever, Cliff. Pagelove, I want you to bury the click. I said, what do you mean? He says, I want you to work so that and he says, when the closer you get to locking in with it, then it's like the metronome drifts into the background.
Yeah.
And then when you're burying it, it's gone entirely. Because you're just nailing it. And he says, and then we talked a little bit about it. I said, when I'm playing in time, but I'm not really burying the click. It's like beat one is this big.
Yeah.
But when you're burying the click and you're smack dab on where it's supposed to be, beat one feels this big.
Right.
And then I have all this room to play within beat one. I can play to the front. I can play to the back. It still be in tempo. I can drag things. But that's probably one of the biggest lessons that I've learned with keeping time is you can manipulate the click.
Absolutely.
I guess that's one way of putting it.
Yeah. And I've always thought of back in the day when it was feasible to do so. I always had a drum machine with me on sessions. I either had I had a Lindrum at one point, and then I had an R8, and then I had an MPC, and then I would do stuff with my laptop. But I would always I would either lay down a click, or I'd have a shaker playing something, so it would be musical. Now I've always looked at the click as just another guy. Let's say we have a 4-piece band, the click is the 5th guy, but his goes perfect. And now I like to, as far as the click goes, it depends on the tempo. For slower stuff, I definitely want it subdivided. If it's really fast, quarter, like above 125, quarter notes are fine.
Right.
But
it's like
a
slow 6/8. You want to.
No, a slow 6/8 is fine with duck, 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 duck,
okay,
duck, or even buck. I mean, there's more space between the notes, but what I don't want is bop, bop, bop. And that can be beneficial too, depending on the tempo.
Now, have you ever done many sessions where you recorded live?
As far as
I was with do you know who Charlie Corch is?
Yes.
Okay, I was with him in the Rhythm Raiders for about 1.5 years, and we recorded an album. And Jim was absolutely determined to do it old school. So we got in the studio and we set up live. Now, the only guy that wasn't in the room with us was the vocalist. Had him in a vocal booth off to the side. Yeah. But we had like little panels with sound thing about knee high, and we sat in a circle. We played in a circle to each other, and we recorded that whole album without a click and live. We didn't need a click because he's Charlie, oh my God, Corch.
Right, yeah.
But we recorded live, and it gave it a totally different vibe than if we tracked it out individually.
I haven't done a lot of that. Even the live records that I recorded, like when I was at Church in the Now and some of the other things, we had clicks. I had a click.
You were at the Church in the Now?
I was.
That's what we used to call that Viva Las Jesus. Because of the big splashy building and everything.
There's a big sign. Yep, absolutely. I did 2 or 3. I think it was at least 2 or 3. Well, I'll say this: one was definitely with a click. The other one was not. It was very free form. Bishop did this series called Washed in the Word, and we would do this thematic background stuff while he was given the word, which was really cool. But we had, like, Jimmy had some ideas that he would play, and we were just vibing off of him, which is very cool. But it was also like live without a net, because there's no overdubbing on it. And most of the time when I do live recording stuff, like I did something with the Mustangs years ago, way back when ago, I still played with a click, but they kept my drum stuff, and then they could overdub everything else. So as far as a live thing like that, it's very rare, because most of the time, I mean, when we do stuff down in Covington, the way we do it at Tune Designer, John plays a bed first, Daniel will play bass, and I'll play drums. We'll get that out of the way, and then Daniel will begin to overdub other guitars, acoustic, electric, and maybe I'll go and add a loop or something, or program, or play some live tambourine or shaker or what have you.
So do you play the trio? You play the trio live? Or track individually?
Yeah. I mean, yes. No, we play it live together.
Got it.
It's to a click. It's definitely to a click. But we play that live together. So, and then your other question is, what's my challenge live? So this is going to sound whatever. A lot of times what you have to be concerned about, especially these days, is not playing too loud live, because a lot of the rooms that I'm playing are small.
Yeah.
I just did 2 private parties up at Cherokee in the casino up there. And the first hour I played with like bundle sticks, because it was but we were still doing the stuff we do, I just had to pull back on the volume. And I was playing with little sticks, but it just had to be quiet. So you got to watch that. The other thing with live.
Well, that concludes our first half of my interview with George Sandler. Come back next week and hear the conclusion. And just as a reminder, for those of my friends in the Christian music community, whenever you play or whenever you sing, you play or sing for the only one that matters. Have a great day. Bye-bye.